Hi and welcome to the latest Raw Umber video. It's Raw Umber Life's first birthday, and to celebrate this I will be painting this birthday cupcake. So let's get started.
So before we start, I would like to talk about the palettes that I will be using. I like using a limited palette of colors because it helps simplify things. In this case, I'm using 3 colors: alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow light, ultramarine blue. You can find links to the colors that I use in the description below the video. And why I chose these colors is when you look at the image, try to analyze the colors that you see. So for the cupcake, I see a light yellow for the lights, dark orange for the shadow. For the background, I see a grayish pink for the lights and a dark grayish pink for the shadows. Finally, for the box, I see an orange for the lights and dark brown for the shadows. The easiest way to cover all of these colors is to pick the yellow, a dark reddish pink and a blue. As you can see on the colorway here, we can mix all the colors in that triangle. The blue will figure as a sort of black in terms of it will gray down the colors that I mix. So for instance, I can mix an orange here using the yellow and red. I could even also mix a green here using the yellow and the blue. But when I mix the two together, they will become a neutral brown that's very close to raw umber in color. And this is the color that I will use for my darks and for my shadows. Now I'm not working directly on wood here. I have primed it myself using a clear acrylic primer, but I've added a ready-made wooden board in the link below the video as well. Now before we start painting, of course you need to draw out what we're going to be painting. So I am going to be using pure linseed oil in my little dipper, and I'm going to dip my brush very lightly in there and then into the mix that we've made a moment ago. And then I can use that to draw the shadow shapes on the canvas board. And I like to just start with the platform here, which is a horizontal line really. And then I like to measure using the end of my brush what the width is for the cupcake. Now in my case, I have the cupcake directly next to my painting, so I can just lay my brush across the setup to figure out the measurements. And this is called side size. If you want to do this as well, what you can do is either set up a cupcake from life and place your painting next to it, or print out the picture that we provide you with and have that next to your canvas. When drawing the outline, try to simplify the lines of whatever you are drawing into a few straight lines. This way, you can use the handle of your brush to figure out the angles and then measure them and simply take them over onto your canvas or board. And this can really help simplify the drawing and make it easier to measure. For most of the drawing, I'm using a hog brush, and the reason for this is because they are nice and soft and they leave nice soft marks. So I tend to use hog brush for the majority of my painting and then use synthetic brushes for a few select applications. Of course, you can find all the materials I'm using in the link below the video. A nice thing about drawing on board is that you can push the paint around because it's really quite slick. For this, I like to use a synthetic brush, dip it into my oil, and then use it to gently push the paint in the direction that I want. And because this board is very slick, it allows me to literally push that paint into place, which helps me create more clear edges. Now I'm pretty happy with the outline. I can start putting the shadow shapes in. Again, I can try to really simplify these into a few straight lines. And the reason I tend to use shadow shapes for the drawing is because it simplifies how I think about it. I don't get confused by all the different colors and tones in the drawing or in the setup. All I need to think about is where's that light shape and where's that dark shape. And when you do this, very quickly you can start seeing a picture emerge. Because paintbrushes obviously don't have a sharp point like a pencil would, they can be a bit imprecise. So again, I like to use the synthetic brush to push the paint around, almost acting like a rubber would in a drawing. And I make sure to clean the brush on a piece of tissue after every stroke. This makes sure that it keeps clean. This really works best on slick surfaces, so make sure to get a board if you are going to try this technique. It won't work as well on paper because paper tends to absorb the oil paint and that doesn't allow you to push it around that much. If you're working on a quick drying medium, for instance acrylic or watercolor, it might be worth to do a quick drawing underneath. just so you know where you're going to be placing everything. When drawing, don't forget about the background. It can feel natural to outline any light areas. For instance, I've outlined the top of the cupcake there. But what is really happening is that the background is in fact darker than that light on the cupcake. So instead of having a line there, I'm gonna go and darken these areas with a light wash. This way, I can already start working out the values of the picture before I do anything on the color. Now I will be working on this picture in an alla prima fashion, meaning I will be finishing it in a single session with all of my paint wet. But if that's not really what you like, because it can be a bit hard to control, feel free to finish the drawing and then have a little break and let the paint dry before you add the colors on top. So now I'm going to add some color on top. I like to start with the lightest light, and this is because it helps me figure out the key of the picture. This means I know where my lightest and my darkest areas are, and I know that everything else I will be mixing will be somewhere in between. So I'm going to start with pure white and place that on the cupcake. And the next lightest area I see is the cream on top of the cupcake. And this is a little bit more yellow, so all I need to do is add some yellow to the white. This will naturally make it a little bit darker, and then I can place that as my second lightest value or my second lightest mix. Try to use thick amounts here, preferably with a hog brush, because you want this light to be thick and pull the eye of the viewer towards the center of your picture. And like I was saying at the beginning of the video, a really nice way to simplify this color mixing stage is to look at each element of the picture and make a maximum of 2 mixes, so 1 dark and 1 light mix. So for the cupcake itself, we have the light already, which is basically white and yellow mixed together. And now I can mix up that dark orange for the bottom of the cupcake. And I know that this is not going to be as dark as the shadows. So what I'm doing is I'm just mixing up an orange with a bit of white in there. And you can see that it sits neatly between the shadow and the light in terms of how dark it is. Now for the top of the box, when we took the samples at the beginning of the video, you could see that that was very similar to the dark area of the cupcake. So I'm going to use that same mix for the top of the box. Now for the background we have two tones again, a light and a dark, and I see the light on the ground being the lighter one. So I'm going to try and mix up a very light pink there, that is roughly as light as the lightest light that I used for my cupcake. So I'm just using some white, a bit of orangey pink. For the rest of the background, I'm going to use a more mid-tone, which shouldn't be quite as light as that light one. So I'm going to start a new mix, making sure that it's roughly the same as the dark mix of the cupcake. And again, I'm just using the alizarin crimson here, the white and just a little bit of yellow. And you can see that the color of the mix is very similar to the lighter one, but it's just a little bit darker. And one thing to note when you're mixing colors like this is that it's a very good idea to always make sure that you're making separate piles for separate mixes. So something I see people do sometimes is that if they need a lighter mix of the same color, they'll just add a bit of white and then continue. But white can really gray down your colors. So it's a good idea to make sure that you make a fresh mix every time. And this can really help make sure that your colors are fresh and not too gray. And feel free to make small adjustments to your mixes. For instance, while I'm doing it and I'm covering the canvas, I see that it's just a bit too orange and I see a bit of a bluish cast in that background. So I'm going to add a bit of blue to that mix just to make it a bit more purpley, and then I'm going to continue on top. So now I have completed the first two phases of any painting, the blocking or the drawing and the covering of the canvas. You should now have a rough idea of the color scheme, the values and the drawing. And on top of this, we can start placing smaller and smaller shapes. So for instance, there's a sliver of light just on top of the box. So what I'm going to do is mix a slightly lighter version of that orange on the top of the box and then place that where I see that shape. This is also a good phase to tackle any issues that you see with the drawing or the colors before you add any more information. So for instance, I see that the side of the box sticks out a bit too far here, so I'm gonna just chop that off before I do anything else. And this is really useful because when you do it a bit later in the drawing, it can already become so complicated to get all the different shapes and shades in, whereas now we have a very few select mixes, so it makes it a lot easier to draw. I'm using one brush for the lights and one for the darks, making sure that I don't muddy the two, and note that after every stroke I like to clean my brush. And this is to make sure that it doesn't slowly muddy the mix every time I touch the canvas or the mixes on my palette. So now I'm going in with my light brush, making sure I clean it first. Then I'm mixing up a slightly muddied version of the white, and I can start adding the small shapes on the top of the cupcake. And as you can see, I like to use a synthetic brush for this because it gives nice clear shapes. And really note that after every stroke, I clean my brush on the tissue and then go back into the mixes. And this is just a really good habit to have because it just helps keep your mixes clean. And another thing I try to do is only touch the canvas maybe 1 or 2 times and then clean the brush again. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the shadow shapes. If at this point you notice, like me, that your palettes become a bit muddy, feel free to top up your paints and remix your main big mixes, maybe with a palette knife to make the mixes a bit bigger. And then we will be talking about mixing up some colors into the shadows. So the main thing when painting the shadows is actually not to look into the shadows too much, but instead to try to look at the edge surrounding the shadows. So the transition from light into the shadows always has its own color, and one thing I can see quite often in paintings is that the light is painted directly into the shadow, which can really muddy the colors up and create a very grayish cast. Instead, what I like to do is to mix up a transition color, which I tend to make a bit cooler because we've got a lot of orange going on here. So having a little bit of a bluish transition color can really brighten up the painting. So I'm just adding a little bit of blue to the shadow and a bit of white just to muddy it up. And then I'm going to use that to surround my shadows. For painting anything inside the shadows, I like to use a synthetic brush. Also make sure that anything on the inside of the shadows has no white, because you want the shadows to feel like they're receding, whereas white is coming out towards the picture. And for the outside of the shadows, I like to use a hog. And this is because it gives the edges a little bit of a ragged quality, a bit of a softer quality, which is something that I'm looking for in this edge. And I'm using a separate brush for this. So I tend to have one brush for the lights, one for the darks, and one for the halftones. And all I'm doing is surrounding this shadow and making sure I'm painting a sort of bridge in between that and the lights. Now, like I was saying, you want to make sure the shadows recede. So even though you can see some detail inside the shadow there, when you squint even slightly at the picture, all of those details disappear. And I'm going to emulate that effect by not putting any of the detail inside the shadow. And the reason for this is because I want the viewer to look at the lights, I want the viewer to look at the cupcake, and I don't want them to spend a long time looking inside the shadow, because that's not really the focus of this picture. Now when I'm painting the outer edges of the shadow, I try to make sure that I'm making them as asymmetrical as possible. And this can actually be quite tricky to do because our brains love looking for patterns. So the instinct may be to make the small shapes all look very similar, all look very the same length, but try to really overstate the asymmetry in the edge of the shadow, because this will actually make the painting look more real and more natural. Now for the last element of the painting, the candle, and I have left this to the last moment because it is very hard to paint something straight, and feel free to use a ruler or a piece of card to help you here. But the main thing to remember is that even the candle itself has a dark side and a light side. So one side is going towards the light and therefore will be a lighter mix, whereas the other side will turn away from the light and therefore have a shadow. So the easiest way I find to do this is to first paint the whole of the candle in its dark shape and then go in with the synthetic brush and try to lightly drag that light shape across from the bottom to the top. And once I have this, I can use the mixes surrounding it to help me with making it a little bit more symmetrical. So for instance, I can use the yellow for the base underneath, and I can use the pink background mix to help me get the tip of the candle right. Finally, what I can do is take the background mix and drag that into the candle to create the stripes.
So that was the end of the video. To celebrate, we are doing a giveaway of this painting, so if you'd like a chance at winning it, have a look at the Raw Umber Instagram account. Thanks again for joining in.